All right, so everybody get ready because we are diving into some pretty choppy waters today.
Oh, yeah.
You know, all that talk about the media and the White House and access and all that.
hmm
Well, things just got a lot more interesting with President Trump's upcoming interview on ABC News.
Yeah, the interview itself is certainly generating a lot of buzz.
Right.
But what's really causing a stir are the rules ABC News has put in place around using excerpts of the footage.
Exactly. And we're not just talking about your, typical copyright stuff here.
Right.
InfoWars commentators are calling this a total power grab by ABC,
Uh-huh.
claiming they're trying to control the president's message.
Yeah.
So we're going to unpack all their arguments. You can decide for yourself if this is standard media practice or something a lot more concerning.
All right, sounds good.
So the main source for this deep dive is an Infowars.com segment.
Okay.
It features commentators Rob Dew, David Knight, and Noah Troy. And they are particularly fired up about what they see as an attempt by ABC News to claim ownership over President Trump's words.
Yeah, through these restrictive copyright rules.
Yeah, what really jumped out at me was this rule that the interview material cannot be used after February 1st, 2025.
Hmm.
What's with that specific date?
Well, that's a really good point, and it's where things get a little tricky.
Okay.
InfoWars is saying that this time limit totally undermines the concept of fair use.
All right, so for anyone who needs a refresher,
Yeah.
fair use is a legal doctrine that allows for the use of copyrighted material without permission in certain situations.
Yeah, exactly.
Think commentary, criticism, news reporting, things like that.
Right. It's a really important cornerstone of free speech, particularly when we're talking about public figures and matters of public interest.
Mm-hmm.
So InfoWars is basically saying that by putting this time limit in place,
Yeah.
ABC is exceeding its rights as a copyright holder and trying to control how the president's words can be used in the future,
Right.
even in situations that would usually fall under fair use.
Interesting. And to really hammer home their point, they brought up the Trans-Pacific Partnership,
Oh, the TPP.
the TPP.
Yeah.
TPP.
Now, the TPP is a trade agreement that was never actually enacted in the U.S.,
Right.
but it was really heavily criticized because people thought it would strengthen copyright control and restrict fair use.
Mm.
So InfoWars is drawing this parallel between the TPP and what ABC is doing,
Yeah.
suggesting that this interview is like a small example of these bigger forces that are trying to stifle free speech and control the narrative.
It's really interesting. And David Knight, he even dropped this bombshell.
Okay.
He said, maybe we should stop calling them the mainstream media and just call them the fascist press.
Wow.
Strong words, right?
Yeah, very strong words. And this kind of brings us to a really important question.
Okay.
Is this just inflammatory rhetoric, or does it actually reflect some real concerns about media bias and control?
It's a good question, and I think we really need to unpack that statement within the larger context of InfoWars' argument.
Hmm.
And a big part of their argument hinges on the role of the White House Correspondents Association,
Okay, the WHCA.
the WHCA.
Right.
And they're painting it as this exclusive club, almost like a trade guild that controls access to the president
Mm-hmm.
and shuts out any alternative viewpoints.
It's an interesting accusation.
Yeah,
It raises some important questions.
for sure.
Does the WHCA actually get in the way of diverse perspectives?
Yeah.
Or are they just trying to keep things organized and make sure everything's professional at the White House?
Right, kind of keep order.
Yeah, think about what they do.
Yeah.
They're there to help facilitate coverage of the president.
Right?
So does that help or hurt having a balanced and fair representation of different viewpoints?
Good question to back up their claims.
Yeah.
InfoWars pointed to that incident from 9 days ago where the Trump administration was thinking about opening up press briefings
Oh, right.
to talk radio hosts and bloggers.
Yeah.
And they claim that the WHCA pushed back hard, insisting on keeping their assigned seats and their limited access.
Well, according to The Guardian, it's true that the WHCA president at the time was very clear that they weren't going to let anyone try to move the established White House reporters from their designated workspace.
Yeah,
But we should consider their perspective, too.
right. Are you saying they might have legitimate reasons for wanting to maintain a certain level of order and control in that press briefing room?
Exactly. Think about the logistics involved.
Mm.
You have to coordinate all these journalists,
Oh, yeah.
make sure everyone gets a fair chance to ask questions and keep a professional environment.
Sure.
It's not crazy for the WHCA to want to manage that whole process.
So are you saying that InfoWars is maybe exaggerating a little bit?
I don't know if I'd say that.
Okay.
I do think there's a valid discussion to be had about whether the WHCA's role accidentally limits access for less established or alternative media.
Right.
but we should try to avoid those big generalizations and think about all the different sides of the situation.
All right, fair enough. Now let's get into this historical example. InfoWars brought up about Obama and the coverage of Obamacare.
Okay. So they claim that ABC News got preferential treatment back then.
Yeah.
With a full week of broadcasting from the White House to promote the healthcare law.
They also said that Republicans weren't given the same access
Right.
and were even blocked from buying ads to counter the information that ABC was presenting.
If that's true, it's pretty damning.
Yeah, it would suggest a level of bias and control that goes way beyond just managing logistics.
Totally. And InfoWars sees a clear connection between that incident and the current restrictions on President Trump's interview footage.
Yeah, they're saying it's all part of this larger pattern of the mainstream media trying to control the narrative and silence opposing viewpoints.
It is a compelling argument, and it begs the question,
What's that?
are they right? Is there a real pattern of bias and control, or are they just picking and choosing examples to fit their narrative?
It's a good question.
I guess it depends on how you interpret those examples.
Right. But even if you dismiss that Obama-era incident as an isolated case, these new restrictions on Trump's interview footage are still pretty eyebrow-raising.
Absolutely. And it's not just the time limit that's a problem.
Right.
InfoWars also had a problem with how ABC was trying to regulate those bugs,
Yeah.
Those station identifiers that you see on the screen.
Yeah.
And they were trying to limit commentary during the interview itself.
Exactly. They're saying that ABC is going beyond typical copyright protection and trying to control how the interview can be used even during live commentary.
David Knight said that this is getting in the way of their work at InfoWars.
Okay.
Because they really rely on immediate reaction and interpretation.
Sure.
They see it as an attempt to silence dissenting voices and control the flow of information in real time.
Wow. It's a really interesting clash between the way traditional media does things and the rise of instant analysis and commentary in the digital age.
Exactly. And it raises some really tricky questions about where do we draw the line between fair use and censorship?
Right.
Who gets to decide how and when a public figure's words can be used?
Yeah.
And what does this all mean for free speech and open debate?
That's a tangled web for sure.
It is.
But let's get back to InfoWars' solution, what they think should happen.
Okay.
They're calling for President Trump to take a really bold stand, publicly rebuke ABC News, and cancel the interview entirely.
Wow.
They think it would send a huge message about pushing back against media overreach.
It's a pretty dramatic idea.
It is.
But think about what could happen.
Yeah.
Would doing something like that actually stop future restrictions?
You're right.
Or would it just make things worse and lead to more accusations of the White House trying to silence the media?
They seem to think it's a no-brainer, but I wonder if it would backfire and create even more controversy.
That's a good point. Publicly denouncing a big news network and canceling a high-profile interview like that could very easily be seen as an attack on the press. And it could just make things worse with those accusations of authoritarianism.
Right.
And it could hurt public trust.
And not to mention the damage it could do to the president's own credibility.
Right. Refusing to talk to the media, even under these restrictive conditions, could be seen as him trying to avoid scrutiny and control the narrative.
Yeah, it's a risky move for sure, and it makes you wonder if this kind of confrontation would actually get them what they want.
Right. Would it actually stop other media outlets from putting similar restrictions in place in the future?
Or would it just create a more adversarial relationship between the White House and the press, making it even harder to have open and honest dialogue?
These are really important questions to think about, and they lead to an even bigger one.
Okay, what's that?
Is there a better way? Is there a solution that addresses the issues that InfoWars has about media control,
All right.
but without doing something so drastic?
You would have to be a pretty nuanced solution.
Absolutely. Finding that solution requires us to really understand the complex relationship between copyright law, free speech, and how media is changing in the digital age.
This is a conversation that goes way beyond this one interview, this one network, even this one president.
I agree.
It's about the foundation of our democracy and how a free and independent press keeps those in power accountable.
Absolutely.
So as we keep trying to figure out this really complex issue,
Yeah.
let's keep those principles in mind.
Yeah.
And let's not be afraid to ask the tough questions, even if the answers are hard to find.
I like that. So let's dig into this idea of the White House Correspondents Association being like a gatekeeper. InfoWars is making it seem like a pretty serious situation, comparing them to like those old European guilds that controlled entire industries.
Right. They even use the word monopoly. Like the WHCA is actually trying to stop competition and keep different voices from having a say. But is that really a fair comparison?
Well, it is true that the WHCA has a certain amount of influence when it comes to getting access to the White House.
Yeah.
They're the ones coordinating press conferences, managing seating arrangements, and they play a part in deciding which outlets actually get credentials. But calling them a monopoly might be a bit much, don't you think?
InfoWars brought up that incident from 9 days ago where the Trump administration was thinking about opening up press briefings to talk radio hosts and bloggers, right? And they claimed the WHCA totally pushed back like they were protecting their territory and refused to share their access.
Well, if you look at The Guardian, the WHCA president back then made it pretty clear that they were not going to let anyone try and displace the established White House reporters from their designated workspace.
Hmm. So are you saying they might have had good reasons for wanting to keep some level of order and control in that briefing room?
Exactly. Think about it. You have to coordinate all those journalists,
Oh, yeah. It'd be a lot.
make sure everyone gets a chance to ask questions and keep things professional.
Uh-huh.
It makes sense that the WHCA would want to manage that whole process.
So is InfoWars blowing this out of proportion then?
I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
I do think there's a real conversation to be had about whether the WHCA accidentally makes it harder for less established or alternative media outlets to get access.
Right.
But I think it's important to not oversimplify things and really consider all the different angles.
That makes sense. All right, so let's dive into that historical example InfoWars brought up about Obama and the coverage of Obamacare. They're claiming that ABC News got special treatment back then, like a full week of broadcasting from the White House to promote the health care law.
Yeah, and they also said that Republicans were not only denied the same level of access, but were actually stopped from buying ads to counter the information ABC was presenting.
Wow, if that's true, that's a pretty big deal.
It suggests a level of bias and control that goes beyond just managing logistics.
Totally. And InfoWars sees a direct link between that incident and the current restrictions on President Trump's interview footage.
Yeah, they're arguing that it's all part of a bigger pattern of the mainstream media trying to control the narrative and shut down any opposing viewpoints.
It's a pretty persuasive argument, it makes you think.
Makes you think, well,
Are they right? Is there really a pattern of bias and control, or are they just cherry picking examples to fit their narrative?
that's the question, isn't it?
I guess it depends on how you interpret those examples, but honestly, even if you say that Obama era thing was just a one off, these new restrictions on Trump's interview are still pretty strange.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just the time limit that's a problem.
Right.
InfoWars also took issue with how ABC was trying to regulate those bugs, those little station identifiers you see on screen,
Right. Right.
and their attempts to limit commentary during the interview itself.
They're saying ABC is going beyond just protecting their copyright and trying to dictate how the interview can be used, even when it's being commented on live.
David Knight actually argued that this is directly impacting their work at InfoWars.
How so?
Well, because they rely so much on immediate reaction and interpretation.
Right. Makes sense.
They see this as an attempt to shut down dissenting voices and control the flow of information right as it's happening.
Wow. It's really interesting to see this clash between how traditional media works and this rise of instant analysis and commentary online.
I agree, and it brings up some really tough questions about where do we draw the line between fair use and censorship?
Right.
Who gets to decide how and when a public figure's words can be used?
And what does this all mean for free speech and open debate?
It's a tricky situation for sure.
It is. So let's get back to InfoWars' solution, what they think should be done.
Right.
They're calling for President Trump to make a big statement, a public rebuke of ABC News, and cancel the interview altogether.
It's a bold move.
It is, they think it would send a really strong message about pushing back against media overreach.
It's definitely a risky move.
For sure.
We have to think about what could happen.
Yeah.
Would it actually prevent future restrictions?
Right.
Or would it just make things worse and lead to even more accusations of the White House trying to silence the media?
I mean, they seem to think it's a pretty obvious choice, but I can't help but wonder if it would just backfire and cause even more controversy.
That's a valid concern. Publicly denouncing a major news network and canceling a huge interview like that could easily be seen as an attack on the press. It could just fuel those accusations of authoritarianism and damage public trust even more.
And what about the impact on the president's own credibility? I mean, refusing to talk to the media, even with these restrictions, could be seen as an attempt to avoid scrutiny and control the narrative.
It's definitely a risky move, and it raises the question of whether this kind of confrontation would actually achieve what they want.
Right. Would it actually stop other media outlets from imposing similar restrictions later on?
Or would it just create a more hostile relationship between the White House and the press,
Yeah.
making it even harder to have open and honest conversations?
These are some really important questions to think about, and it leads to an even bigger question.
What's that?
Is there a way to address these concerns that InfoWars has about media control, but without resorting to such drastic measures?
I think there might be, but it would require a really deep understanding of the complex relationship between copyright law, free speech, and how media is evolving in the digital age.
It's a conversation that goes way beyond just this one interview, this one network, even this one president.
It really does.
It's about the very foundation of our democracy and the role of a free and independent press in holding those in power accountable.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So, as we continue to try and unravel this incredibly complex issue,
Yeah.
let's keep those principles in mind
Uh,
and let's not be afraid to ask the tough questions, even if the answers are hard to find.
Well, we've spent a lot of time on this deep dive, really digging into this whole ABC interview controversy.
Yeah.
And it's pretty obvious that InfoWars sees this as like a way bigger issue, almost like a threat to their entire way of working.
Yeah, they're basically arguing that this is about so much more than just a copyright fight. For them, it's about the core of journalism, a battle against what they see as this organized attempt by the mainstream media to like control the narrative and silence dissenting voices. They haven't held back either. Calling the mainstream media the fascist press and comparing them to oppressive guilds from way back when. Those are some pretty strong words, but it does make you wonder, are they totally wrong or is there actually something to what they're saying?
I think we should recognize that concerns about media bias and consolidation, those aren't new ideas, and they're not just coming from one side of the political spectrum either.
Right, like throughout history, people have always argued about who controls the information we get and how that information is presented.
Exactly. And the internet and social media haven't helped. They've just made things louder with so many different voices all competing.
Right.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed and not know who to believe anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where critical thinking becomes so important. We can't just believe everything we see and hear. We have to be careful about where we get our information, question sources, consider different perspectives, and even be open to changing our own minds.
Exactly.
And InfoWars isn't the only group raising these concerns about media bias. And even though their style can be a little intense, it's important to remember that they're not the only ones who feel frustrated with how the media works today.
They're tapping into a real feeling.
Yeah.
This sense that the usual sources of information can't be trusted and that alternative voices are being ignored or silenced.
Right, and that brings us back to their call to action, what they think Trump should do.
Right.
They want him to stand up against what they see as ABC News, overstepping, to fight back against these strict copyright rules and defend the right to free and open discussion.
Their solution, publicly criticizing ABC and canceling the interview is definitely dramatic. And it could either blow up in their faces or completely change how the media works.
Yeah, it's impossible to say what would happen, but it does bring up important questions about the relationship between the White House and the press and what this all means for freedom of speech and access to information.
And those questions go way beyond this one interview or this one network, even this one president.
It's about the core principles of a working democracy. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, let's leave you with one final thought. In a world where we're constantly bombarded with information and the media is changing so fast, how do we make sure that different voices are heard, that the information we get is accurate and fair, and that we protect free speech?
That's the big question, isn't it? And there are no easy answers, but it's a conversation we need to have and one that we all play a part in figuring out.